First and foremost, thank you for this interview. And I will start with a question that I hope will help us all get to know you a bit better. When did you decide to become a writer?
That's a tough question for me.
Yes, it is an icebreaker. Yeah.
I get asked that a lot, but for me, there was never a moment of decision. It was always something that I wanted to do. Before I could even write, I was telling stories and having my mom write them down. So I like to say that I was writing stories before I could write. And it's just always been something, it's been something that is the kind of thing for me that if I'm not working on a story, either on the page or in my head, then I really don't feel like I'm fulfilled. And so it really feels more like a calling for me than a profession. I know that sounds cheesy, but it's just a part of my identity that is it's just in my blood and always has been.
Now, why a book for children with trauma and friendship at its core, like The Ethan I Was?
So when I came up with the idea for The Ethan I Was before, I was working in a school in an urban area in the States that had a lot of children who were dealing with really tough traumas. Some of them, it might be a death in the family or the death of a friend. It might be a broken family. And at the time, I didn't really see a lot of stories that were responding to those kind of issues that kids all over the country and all over the world are facing. And so I wanted to write something that would respond to that, but in a hopeful way. And so that's really where the friendship and Coralie come into the story. So I think that you hit the nail on the head there. It's the blend of both the trauma, the tough stuff, and then the stuff that really makes life worth living and helps us go on, which is those relationships that we have with our friends.
It's a beautiful blend and it's very touching. I totally loved it from a literary point of view, from a fictional point of view, and from a humane point of view. Actually, I felt like all the children in the book deal with trauma at some point. They all have a dark secret, whether we're talking about Ethan or Coralie or Suzanne, who had a hard time herself. So, but it's the fact that children respond so differently to trauma. And I felt that was another thing you wanted to emphasize, the fact that we all have our dark secrets and we all respond differently to that.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where it's very easy to look at someone and take what we know about them and think that we have the whole picture and judge them for it. Yeah. Right. And so any one of these characters could have done that with the other characters, but they all kind of dig a little bit deeper, with the exception, of course, of maybe Suzanne, who doesn't dig quite as deep. But that is part of her response, as you say. So it's kind of learning to meet people where they are and to understand that there's always more there than meets the eye. There's always more that people are dealing with.
Which character did you most enjoy creating?
Well, you know, oddly, Coralie was the first character who came into my head before I knew what I wanted to write a book about. She was the one who had kind of been walking around with me for a long time. And so I really enjoyed bringing her to life. She's very loosely based on a childhood friend that I had growing up. And she was the type of friend, I think often we experience one or two of these people as we're growing up who she was a wonderful girl. She was a really close friend of mine, and she would tell lies all the time. You know, here's where I went on spring break. Here's this famous person I'm related to, and on and on. And even as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old, I knew that she was lying. And I just didn't understand why, but I liked her enough that I could set that aside. And it wasn't until I was a little bit older that I realized that she had a really sick mom. Her mom had MS. I'm not sure what that's called there, but a degenerative disease.
Yes, exactly.
That made it really, really hard. You know, when she got off the school bus every day, her life was not like mine. Her life was really, really tough. And instead of just telling me what was going on and telling people what was going on. I think she didn't feel comfortable being open about it. I think her response was to try to escape through these stories that she told for herself. She was a storyteller too, much in the way that Coralie is. And so I have just always been struck by that and have remembered that as the years have gone on. And when I decided that I wanted to write a book, I thought how cool it would be to have a character there that really plays that, walks that fine line between storytelling and lying, because when we tell stories, we are telling lies, but they're okay because we're telling stories, and our teachers tell us that we should be creative and write stories. But then there's this other type of story that society tells us not to tell. And so I was really interested in a character that kind of played with that line between those types of stories.
Well, you definitely got that right. And it's quite impressive because for me, I must say, before being a book about trauma and friendship and growing up and loss and so on, it's a book about fiction as a survival mode.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And we all have, whether some of us aren't, it's not as obvious as Coralie, but we all have things that we tell ourselves to get by as a survival mechanism. And exactly. I think right now, more than any other time, I always find that I write the most when my personal life is the most troubled. The first manuscript that I ever wrote, I wrote after the death of a good friend to whom this book is dedicated. And now with the pandemic and the world being so uncertain, writing and storytelling are again a big escape for me, and reading too, I suspect, is probably an escape for you and for many people. So yeah.
How did it change you? I mean, the process of writing this story, which is quite consuming. It's consuming for the reader. I can only assume it's quite consuming for the writer.
Yeah. So I wrote this book. I started dreaming about it when I was teaching. And then halfway through that school year, my now husband got a job in the UK. And so we relocated to Cambridge in the United Kingdom. And I didn't know anybody there besides my husband. I didn't have a visa. I couldn't get a job. I mean, I had a visa, but I couldn't work there. And so I was at this moment in my life where I didn't really have anything except for this idea for a story. And so the first draft was, as you say, very consuming. I sat down and I wrote it in about 6 weeks, which is really fast, but I knew that we all have these voices in our head that tell us, maybe this isn't as good as you think. Maybe you're not the person to write this story. And I knew that the longer I waited to get that first draft done, the louder those voices were going to get. And so I wanted to get through it as quickly as possible, because then when you have a first draft, you're not just going to throw that away. You're going to go back and do your best to make it work and to bring it closer to that vision of what it was in your head. And so that was kind of why I sped through it. And so it was really empowering for me, actually, to get to the end and have finished this book at a time in my life when really I was kind of a little bit aimless, to feel like it gave me that sense of purpose.
How did you decide on the title? Because you actually tell us about this split in Ethan's identity from the very beginning.
Yeah, the title came to me as I was writing the book. There's a chapter within the book that is also called The Ethan I Was Before. And when I wrote that title of the chapter, I realized this is the title of my book, because it is about this transformative moment that splits our life into two. And we can never be the person that we were before this, Ethan can never be who he was before the accident with Casey. And we all have these moments in life, good and bad, that kind of split us and create us into a new person. And so this book is about, okay, well, I can't be the person I was before. And so now who am I? So I thought the title really captured that question and that journey that Ethan is on.
How difficult was it for you to let Casey go? I mean, to actually resist this, what I imagine must be the temptation of a sunny, happy ending in a book meant for a younger audience.
Yeah, I mean, it was tough in one way. Like, those scenes were very hard to write. Yes. I think I was not a parent when I wrote the book. Now it would be much, much harder, I think, to write those scenes. But at the same time, that was always going to happen. That was the ending that I had in my mind all along. And so in that way, it felt quite straightforward to write because I had been coming to that point for the whole book. However, I get a lot of emails from readers now who ask me, would I consider, you know, doing a sequel where Casey wakes up? And that does make me feel a little bit guilty.
Do you have a favorite moment in the book?
There's a lot of favorite moments. One of them was definitely writing the scene in the Blackwood house. I love, as a kid, I was fascinated by these abandoned houses, of which there were many around where I grew up, and fascinated by the history and what kind of things might go on in them. And so to get to bring that scene to life was really, really fun. I loved writing the scenes with Coralie in the library with Mac. Those were two of my favorite characters to bring to life. And then writing the climax scene where they're out in the hurricane and the wolves come into play. That was really exciting too, because that also felt like a moment that I'd been building to for a long time. So I wrote that scene as I was listening to, you know, I found on YouTube like recordings of what it sounds like to be in a hurricane. And so I was listening to those as I wrote it.
What did you learn about yourself after writing this book?
That's an interesting question. I mean, when I wrote this book, I saw it as a way to respond to what my students had been going through. I did not see it as a way to respond to anything within myself. And it was only after I had written the book and people close to me had read it and said, oh, this is about what happened to Arun, who was my friend who passed away in an accident, not so dissimilar from what happens to Casey. And the whole time I had been writing this book, I had not thought about him. I had not thought that this was a book about him. And I realized, yes, this was me writing about, in part, my experience of going through that grieving process and having that survivor's guilt and all of these things that we have when someone we love leaves us in an untimely way, in a quick way. And so it was really quite shocking to me in retrospect that I could write a story so close to my own experience and not realize that I was writing from experience. It was obviously something that my soul really needed to do, but I wasn't ready to acknowledge until it was done.
Sometimes a story is all you have, and that can be enough. This is my favorite quote in the book. I totally love it.
Yeah.
And my question is somehow related to it. It's my last question. Where are you right now in your story?
In the story that I'm currently writing?
In whatever you please, in the story you're living, in the story you're writing, at which point?
Oh, gosh. I would say that I'm at a growing point. This year has challenged everyone in so many ways. It's been a very strange year to become a parent. I gave birth to my son on January 20th and had about a month and a half with him before the world ground to a halt. And so in my personal life, it's been a stretch to try to become a mother, to try to adjust to the world that we're all adjusting to. And in the stories that I'm currently writing or sitting with in my head, they're both stories that are things that are scary to me that I haven't tried before. One is a historical novel that takes place during World War II and deals with some issues that are really close to my heart and are things that are really hard to discuss. The other is an adult novel, which is something that I've never attempted before. And so I feel like in all areas of my life, it's really about seeing how far I can push myself and seeing what other places I can go that I didn't think that I would be able to end up in when I started out on this journey.
Thank you so very much. It's been truly wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.